I guess so. We want to get started. So again, so this is a hybrid. So my microphone is always on, and I hope that the audio, there's no audio issue for the remote Zoom audience, but that if there's any issue, please let me know as soon as possible. Okay, so I got to sum up. So we're gonna continue discussing this OpenP, so you can see the slide by yourself from the homepage. Okay, the other way. Okay. Okay, by the way, so before we get started, where's the browser? Okay, this one. So today's plan is, so I'm going to talk sometime about the OpenP, and hopefully you have some time to work on the PD01 Jupyter notebook thing. So maybe we go between these two and back and forth during the class time. Okay, let's get started. So yes, so we left off around here in the last week. So anyway, so just as a reminder, so I'll get started with this slide again this week. So we have been we are talking about OpenP. These are two programmers you wanna learn in the beginning. Pragma OMP parallel and Pragma OMP4. And by the way, so all OpenP directives or pragmas have the common format as hash pragma OMP as something. So essentially you need to learn only two keywords here, so parallel and for. And this is what happened overall. So these two things are actually used often used together, but still important to understand what each of them actually does. So let's get started with this parallel thing. So here's the basic syntax. So you have a arbitrary C statement, and if you insert this pragma OMP parallel just above any statement, what happens is that you create some number of threads specified by the environment variable OMP num threads, which I talked about the last week. So let's say OMP num threads happens to be 4. Then what happens looks like this. So whoever encounters this OMP parallel and S creates the team of threads, the team of 4 threads. The current thread, the thread which encounters this OMP parallel becomes what is called the master of this team. And somewhat more important is this S will be executed by each member of the team. So it's not that S is somehow parallelized with this OMP parallel pragma alone. So I'll get to that shortly. And the master, after finishing this S by itself, waits for other guys to finish S as well. So in other words, this statement that comes after S will be executed only after all of these threads finish S. So here's some examples. So the only thing I need to emphasize here is that, so this OMP parallel affects the only statement that comes right after this. So in this case, so printf word is the only statement that is affected by this parallel. So if you specify, let's say, OMP num threads equal 4, this word is executed by each, is executed 4 times, because this line number 5 is the only statement that is executed by each of these 4 threads. So hello and bye is printed only once, no matter how many threads you create. So what does this parallel program actually do in the implementation? So well, actually, so the language spec generally does not speak too much about how it is exactly implemented. So even if you look into the OpenP spec, this is not something that is precisely specified by the specification. But in practice, you can consider that threads. So also OpenP threads I was talking about in the last slide is essentially the thread supported by the operating system, such as pthread. So for example, if you write this program and run it as with this OMP num threads equal 50, you can think that so 50 OS level threads will be created. So it has some performance implications. So it suggests the correct way you are supposed to use this parallel program. So the main thing is, so even if, for example, if you have, if you think you have, for example, 1,000 work of whatever you need, you don't actually want to create 1,000 OpenP threads, because each of them corresponds to the OS level thread, and normally you don't want to create OS level thread as many as 1,000 on the machine that has only, for example, dozens of cores, let's say. So basically, when you specify this number, you basically need to pretty much aware that how many cores you actually have on the platform. So this is so I got okay, I got a question. Virtual cores, right? Yeah, yes, basically virtual cores. So yeah, so it actually depends. So sometimes you want to limit the number of OpenP threads to the number of physical cores. So it somewhat depends on what each thread actually does. So if each thread has enough amount of internal or instruction level parallelism, there's no point in going beyond the number of physical cores. But generally speaking, it often makes sense to create OpenP threads as many as the number of virtual cores, in generally speaking. Yes. So this is OMP parallel. But again, one point I need to emphasize here is that so OMP parallel create threads, each of which will be doing exactly the same statement. So in a way, it's kind of redundantly doing the same work. So in other words, it's not a way to parallelize work per se. So ultimately, the purpose of doing parallel processing is to reduce the amount of time it takes to do some amount of work. So normally, you need to somehow distribute the same amount of work among threads. But this parallel directive alone cannot accomplish that. So the other thing you need to master is okay, so you have some number of threads doing the same statement S. Then how you distribute the the work you need to do for this program among those threads. So actually, there are two ways to do this. So of course, there are more than two ways, but one two ways I will be getting into somewhat. So one is so-called do-it-yourself type of strategy. The other thing is to use something called work sharing construct, which is actually OMP4 directive. So before getting into the OMP4 directive, I just want to point out that there's very primitive but very general way to distribute whatever work among these, which is to use these functions or OpenMP functions and distribute or partition work in whichever way you like. So what are they? So one is a function called OMP get num threads, which return the number of threads in the team you are in. For example, in this setting, when any of these threads calls OMP get num threads, it gets 4. And the other API is something called OMP get thread num, which returns the ID of the calling thread in the team it is in. So for example, this thread, when this thread calls OMP get thread num, it is likely to get 0. And when this guy calls the same function, it will get 1, etc. So these are actually very primitive, but so in theory, this is what the all you need. So once you know how many threads are there, and my position in the team, my name in the team, you can actually divide the work in whatever way you like. So here's a simplest example to divide the entire iteration from 0 to n-1 among this empty number of threads. So the details are not very important, but basically it is dividing the interval 0 to n in the simplest way you can think of. So, but this is, of course, theoretically all you need, but it's very inconvenient. So here comes the work sharing concept, and I'm getting into this 4 problem, which I briefly already introduced. So like I said several times, this parallel construct and OMP get num threads and OMP get thread num. In theory, all you need to do things in parallel. So once you know how many threads are there and in which position I'm in, then you can divide the work in whichever way you like. But you can easily realize that it's very inconvenient. So OpenMP, so define several ways to partition some amount of work among threads. So they are generally called work sharing constructs. And I'm going to get into 2 work sharing constructs. One is for pragma, and the other is task pragma. So here comes the pragma OMP4. So for pragma. So the syntax is, yeah, I think it's you can easily imagine pragma OMP4 followed by a C's for statement like this. And generally, so it is useful only when it's encountered inside the parallel region. So when a team of threads is executing a parallel region inside of the parallel pragma. So when they encounter this for statement with this OMP4, then they divide the entire iteration space among these threads. So this is what OMP4 is. So yeah, like I said, simply the thread in the team divide the iterations among them. So how exactly they are divided among the threads? So it is determined by something called a scheduling clause. And before getting into this scheduling clause, so you have to know that there are so many restrictions. It's not that OpenMP can parallelize arbitrary for loops for you. So there are so many restrictions. So the most basic restriction is that, so when you say, okay, this is done by many threads, so several threads, and iterations are divided among these threads created by OMP parallel, then iterations will be executed in any order, and they may even interleave. So iteration 0 and iteration 1, so maybe executed in the opposite order from what you normally expect in the serial execution, 0 and 1, then 1. But furthermore, execution of these two iterations may overlap, may interleave. So that the program must not rely on the order in which they execute in any way or whatsoever. And furthermore, so even if you accept the fact that iterations may be executed in any order or may interleave, there are further strong syntactic restrictions for the kind of for loop you can parallelize. You can divide the work among threads. So basically, well, so most simply stated, it has to be a very simple stereotypical for loop like this. So I equal from something up to some limit, and the increment at each iteration must be constant. So this kind of very stereotypical simplest loop is the only for loop that this OMP4 can apply. So this restriction exists. So somewhat more specifically, so this init and limit and increment must all be loop invariant. So they must not change during the execution of the loop. So this restriction it exists so that the runtime system can easily identify the entire iteration space. So the iteration space is basically the set of all the index variables. So before actually executing any iteration, when the execution reaches this line 2, if the for loop looks as simple as this, you can easily identify here's the possible values of this index variable I very easily, right? So if init is 0 and limit is, let's say, 100 and increment is 1, it is simply the set of all the integers from 0 up to 99, right? So in this way, the dividing the iterations among threads becomes very easy task for the runtime system to do. So this is the restriction you need to remember. So here's how our running example of sparse matrix vector multiply could be written using this pragma OMP4. So what it takes is only to insert this OMP parallel somewhere, and assuming that you are inside this OMP parallel, you have this for loop iterating over each row of the output vector. you simply say OMP4. So you want to divide all rows of output vectors into some number of threads you just created with this parallel problem. So basically, this thread works on these rows, and the next thread works on other set of rows. And you simply divide the work among threads by dividing the entire matrix into rows. Okay. So far, is there any question? Okay, so this is on before. And so one thing I like to note here, so I'll come back to this point later, is so maybe you remember there are two ways to represent sparse matrix. So one is something called compressed. Sorry, what was that? Compressed. What is this? Compressed. Why I don't remember. Yeah, so compressed sparse row. So the point of this compressed sparse row format is, so all non-zero elements of a particular row, a particular single row, are in the consecutive interval, consecutive region of the non-zero element array. So you simply know, okay, this is where this particular row I is started in the non-zero element array, and this is where it ends. So the entire work among the entire work is partitioned among threads in such a way that any single row is only worked on by a single thread, because this outer loop is the only loop that gets divided among threads. So there's no possibility that two threads work on the same row. But remember that there was another representation called, it was coordinated order. Sorry, why I don't remember. So this is in a way a simpler format conceptually. So each non-zero element is represented by triples, ij and the value. Yes, coordinated in this format, cool. And in this format, sparse matrix vector multiplier is simply a single loop. So there's no particular loop iterating over all rows. So this single loop iterates over all non-zero elements. So when you simply apply OMP4 to this sparse matrix vector multiply in this coordinated list format, then something wrong will start happening. So I'll get into this later, but in this in this case, I just note that there are possibilities that two threads happen to work on different non-zero elements on the same row. So what happens in that case is, so I is the same between two or more threads. So two or more threads are trying to write into the same element of Y. So something bad is going to happen. So I'll get to this later. So before getting into this, so I'll get to the scheduling I briefly mentioned. So this specifies when you have an OMP4 loop, OMP4 directive, how iterations get distributed, how these iterations get partitioned among these threads. So this is specified by something called the schedule clause in a work sharing for loop. So it determines how the iteration space are divided among threads. And specifically, there are three ways you can say that this is how I wanna you to divide the work among threads: static, dynamic, and guided. So here's a simple illustration. So each of these clauses may come with the line you say OMP4. So OMP4 and say schedule static. So when you say this, it's simply a very predictable round robin way of dividing the entire iteration space. So let's say this is the entire iteration space. So let's say, for example, 0 to n-1, and you have 4 threads. So when you simply say schedule static, then what happens is this. So that the color indicates which threads will be working on a particular iteration. So this is often the simplest, and this is indeed the default in many cases. And this works well for the loop whose iterations, each iteration gets almost exactly the same amount of work. So you simply divide the number of iterations each thread will be working on, then the entire work will be evenly distributed among threads. You can also specify the chunk size after this static. Then, for example, when you say static comma 3, then the first thread gets the first 3 iterations. The next thread gets the next 3 iterations. And if all of these, all threads get one chunk, then the first thread gets another chunk like this. So again, this is completely predictable. So given the entire iteration space, each thread immediately knows on which iterations it needs to work on. So another strategy is something called dynamic. So basically, the work is divided at runtime based on the progress of other threads. So what actually happens is it becomes unpredictable. So for example, in this particular case, this purple thread happens to be the first one that becomes available. So it gets the first iteration and works on it. Meanwhile, this green thread becomes available next. So it simply fetches the next iteration that has not been started by anybody else. So this just goes on until all the iterations have been fetched by some threads. So I got a question. What if the iterations are increasing in computation and memory complexity? Not sure I completely understand what you're asking, but probably you are, if I understand, probably you are talking about the situation in which different iterations have a different amount of work. Is it what you're thinking about? Yes. So yeah, this is exactly why you need something like a dynamic. So in the situation you described, this schedule static is not the right way to divide the work among them. Right, so when you do this dynamic scheduling, then for example, if the first iteration takes so long, then what happens at runtime is this purple thread will not become available for a long time. So the next time it will fetch another iteration will be away after after so long, right? Did I answer to your question? So basically, dynamic is the scheduling strategy you should use in these circumstances. Okay. And schedule guided is somewhere between them. So it is a heuristics, and again, what actually happens is unpredictable. It depends on how iteration progress at runtime, and it also depends on the implementation. But the general idea is that in the beginning, each thread fetches a large amount of chunks. So it's a large chunk. For example, in the beginning, it fetches, for example, 10 iterations at a time. And in later stages, it fetches a smaller number of iterations at a time. So that in a way, so it is trying to strike the balance between the overhead of fetching the work from some shared counter or something like that. So in the dynamic scheduling, there must be some data structure representing, okay, this is the next work you need to do when you become available. And each thread needs to check this counter and make sure that it gets the next iteration it should work on. So you don't want to do that too many times, too frequently. So in the beginning, in this guided scheduling, in the beginning, when it sees this counter, whenever it checks this counter, it tries to get a large amount of work. But in the end, it tries to balance the work among all threads as much as possible. So this is the basic idea. But in practice, I don't find this guided scheduling very useful oftentimes. So generally, if you are sure that static will be enough, then use static. Otherwise, you use some form of dynamic. And here's one thing you may find useful. So in your program, you say schedule runtime without specifying a fetch in the program. And when you run the program, you can specify which particular scheduling strategy you want to use in this particular run by this environment variable OMP schedule. So you can say pretty much the same thing as you will say in your program like this, but without hard coding which particular strategy you want to use in your program. Another small point, so it's not a very profound thing, but practically useful is this notion of collapse clause, which is another clause you can add to the OMP4 directive. It is basically saying that you want to divide the work of nested loops that comes after this OMP4. For example, when you say OMP4 collapse 2, you want to look at these doubly nested loops. So what happens is that it not only divides the work in using this the outer loop index I, you divide the entire n square iterations by whichever threads are available. So this is the only way you can divide the work of multiple nested loops in OpenMP. So without this collapse, you can only divide the work of a singly nested loop. So no really nested loops you can parallelize. And actually, again, there's very severe, strict syntax restriction. So when you want to divide the work of, for example, doubly nested loop, the loop must be so-called a perfectly nested loop. What I mean by that is the so first of all, the iteration space must be a rectangular. So the iteration counts of the inner loop must not depend on the index variable of the outer loop. For example, if it is j up to, for example, I, then it's not, it cannot be applied. And the other thing is there must be no intervening statement between different levels of the nest. So there must be no statement, for example, between line 2 and 3. So this renders this loop nest non-perfectly nested. So you can apply this collapse across only to perfectly nested rectangular nested loop. So fairly restrictive, but it is nevertheless sometimes the useful and sometimes the only way you can parallelize nested loops. So I'm going to show how these scheduling clauses affect how the work is divided among threads in real time by visualizing things. So what I'm going to show is that you have an OpenMP program that essentially works like this. So you have two-dimensional, so doubly nested loops, which in total by that does n square work. And each iteration does something called a unit work. And the amount of work done by this unit work depends on where these ij exist in this entire iteration space. So the amount of work done by this single unit work is systematically skewed, just to show how different scheduling strategies have different performance. So I made the amount of work so that it is essentially zero in the lower triangle. So this region, the amount of work is almost there. So these iterations will finish very quickly. And the upper triangle, it is randomly drawn from 100 to 10,000 clocks. So here, so you just remember that the actual work is done only in this upper triangular region, and how scheduling affects how the work is divided and therefore performance. You can actually do it by yourself in the notebook, but just for the sake of explanation, I will do that in front of you here. So, what is that? Is working the workplace. So you can actually see get the almost the same thing from the Jupyter lab environment, but this is essentially the OpenP program I just talked about in the slides. So okay, so here you have doubly nested for loop, which is scheduled by this runtime directive. So I can change the scheduling scheduling strategy at runtime. And you also notice that this is a collapse too. So the entire doubly nested loop is divided among threads. I guess it's already compiled. And let's say you wanna have 4 threads, and or just run it with the default scheduling strategy, which is going to be static. Then I'm just visualizing it. So this is what actually happens. Actually, it does the same thing twice. So this is the second time. So let me explain what this visualization illustrates. So this is the entire iteration space. And the color, as you can easily imagine, indicates which thread happen to work on that. And you just, so as I explained in the slide, actually the lower triangle part doesn't have almost any work. I have to plug my PC adapter. Sorry, the battery may be going away. It's gonna be a disaster when it happens. Okay, so like I said, this lower triangle part doesn't have almost any work. So I guess you have already noticed that this lower part finishes very quickly, right? So and the red part is taking much longer time than this blue part, right? So someone already asking the question. This is exactly the problem of static load balancing. So each iteration may have some different amount of work. Then static scheduling is not going to work very well. And you can change the scheduling strategy by saying point B schedule equal, for example, dynamic. Then what happens will be very different, and you can easily see the difference in the visualization. So what is actually happening is that this what looks like just a noise is actually a very how the work is, how the iteration is divided among threads in a very fine grained way. So it's almost like when a particular thread works on this particular iteration, the next iteration is almost likely to be executed by a different thread. So this is why you see something like this. And you can, so you can instinctively think that, okay, this may not be very efficient because there will be so many. You don't know exactly how this is done, but you can easily imagine that there must be some runtime mechanism in which you will determine which thread works on a particular iteration. So you don't want to do things exactly in this way because it takes so many coordination communication. So you can somewhat control the overhead by saying the chunk size is, for example, 100. Then what happens is that each time a thread gets the next chunk of work it has to work on, it tries to fetch at least 100 iterations. So the work distribution becomes something like this. So each time a thread fetches some amount of work, it tries to get, at least 100 consecutive iterations. So that's how you can somewhat control the overhead and work distribution. So is there any question at this point? Okay, then I guess with that, So you have some time to work on this Jupyter notebook. So just continue working on PD, OMP, PD01 OMP. So whichever part you're still working on. So let's have something like 20 minutes or something. Just try to understand and work on this PD01 thing. And actually, you get other two Jupyter notebooks. So one is a CUDA, which I will not get into for today. And the other thing is this PD03 OMP get this, which does exactly what I have just demonstrated. So you can do the same visualization inside this notebook, if you like. So let's have something like 20 minutes for doing your work. And if you have questions, just come and ask or ask in the chat.
Yeah, that's what I did. Yeah. One thing is that
You're taking the microphone again? Okay, I think you can hear that. So let's get back to this talk. Okay, so let me get started again. So actually, so some remarks for the folks in the room. So turned out that this microphone is very sensitive, so that remote audience can hear pretty much what you are talking about. So so please refrain from talking while I'm speaking. Okay. And I was just muted while you are working on this hands-on class for your better privacy. But, okay, so let's get started again. So I just talked about several ways to divide the work among threads for the OMP4 plasma. And yeah, this is what I have just demonstrated. And I think it's a useful practice to think about how to apply this thing to the learning example we are using, which is sparse matrix with multiplication. So it for more specifically for complex sparse row format. So the issue is you have OMP4 and each iteration works on a single row. And what kind of scheduling strategy is most appropriate for this? So just like I said several times and asked by one of those one of your students. So this, for example, when you apply the default static scheduling, it works only when each row has almost exactly the same amount of work, right? So it divides it gives the same number of iterations to each thread. So for load balancing, it implicitly assumes that each iteration takes roughly the same amount of time. So it is often not the case. So in many sparse matrix that appear in real data, for example, if you have a sparse matrix representing the wave graph or a social network graph, the number of non-zero elements in each row are quite different from one row to the next. So you may consider applying dynamic or guided scheduling to somewhat alleviate it. Let me turn off my audio in the smart. So so dynamic and guided scheduling certainly helps to some extent. But if there's a single row that has extremely large number of rows, it may still not be so extremely large number of non-zero elements. It may not still be enough. So the ultimate strategy and the more robust strategy is to partition non-zeros, not only rows. So which is essentially doing something like this. So COO format, so coordinate list format, simply list all the non-zero elements in a flat one-dimensional array. So if we apply static scheduling for this loop, then it's gonna be fine as far as the load balancing is concerned. But again, like I say, having two or more threads trying to update the same element of Y it's going to be an issue. It's going to be a correctness issue, not a performance issue. So here comes another way of dividing the work among threads, which is called a task parallelism. But I got a question in the chat. Okay, so the question was, if each row has same amount of work, both static and dynamic could operate the same. No, I think that there will be a well, actually, like I suggested in the passing, the dynamic scheduling has its own disadvantage, which is it takes some coordination and communication at runtime, so that each thread works on an iteration that has not been worked on any other thread so far. So static is sort of very simple and does not require any coordination or communication at runtime, because on each thread it needs to work on, each thread needs to work on, is completely determined by the number of iterations and the number of threads. Does that make sense? Okay, yes. So if the static is known to suffice, then you can go ahead with static and can reduce some amount of overhead. Okay, so let me get into another OpenMP directive called a task. So it's also conceptually somewhat different from ordinary for loop load balancing. So it is something called a task parallelism. So actually, it was added later than OpenMP was initially released. So its original focus was simple parallel loops, just like I already explained. So starting from somewhere like version 3.0 or OpenMP version 3.0, it starts supporting what I'm going to explain, something called a task parallelism. But before getting into this, I guess you want to understand why it's necessary. What is the point? So I initially kind of suggested that the theoretically parallel is all you need. So OMP parallel is all you need. And well, so there's a OMP4 program that makes dividing the work among threads for loops somewhat more convenient. So what else you need? But here's the limitation of the combination of OMP parallel and OMP4. So one is, like I already suggested in passing, the nested parallelism. So you have a for loop and another for loop nested inside it. And like I said, if these two doubly nested loops, a loop makes something called a perfectly nested loop, you can simply say a collapse 2 or something like that, to make each of these iterations the subject of distributing work to underlying threads. But like I said, there was a syntax restriction that says that there must be nothing between these four statements. So if for example, you have only dozens of iterations in the outer loop and another dozens of iterations in each of these inner loops, then you will totally have something like 100 iterations. So each of these loops may not be enough to extract sufficient amount of parallelism. But if you combine these two, ending up with something like 100 iterations in total, it may be enough. So in those circumstances, the restriction of the original OMP4 is a fairly serious restriction. And you may consider a similar but a more complex situation in which So you have outer loop, which calls another function in which you have another for loop. So again, by combining these two for loops, you may be able to extract a sufficient amount of parallelism, but each single loop may not be enough. So in those circumstances, you want to have something else. And the more profoundly different circumstances, that something like this. So for what's so-called parallel recursion. So just imagine you are writing a quick sort algorithm. So if you know something about it, so it simply calls two. So it makes two recursive calls to itself. So if you and again you can so if you know something about a quick sort, so each of these two recursive calls will be working on a different region of the array. So basically you divide the entire array into things. So one that is less than a particular element, and the other larger than a particular element, and you sort individual sections, and you can do them independently, right? And if you, for example, execute these two recursive calls in parallel, so you end up with extracting a fairly large amount of parallelism. So even if this a single function call creates only two child works, but if you do this recursively, so you end up creating so many independent work that can be done in parallel, right? But again, so parallel 4 and OMP4 is not powerful enough to do this kind of things in parallel. So in short, so parallel 4 can handle nested parallelism very well. And so there's some complicated story about what the specification exactly says about this nested parallelism. So you can extract some level of parallelism from nested parallel region or nested parallel for loops, but all in all, it's very restricted. So it's not very flexible. And actually, the fundamental underlying limitation is the mechanism with which it distributes it distributes work among different threads is very simplistic. So each task is represented by just a loop index, right? So this is how, for example, dynamic scheduling divides the work among threads. So it's not general enough, and tasks are exactly for addressing these limitations. Basically, the basic idea behind task is, so at any point in the execution of your program, you can simply say, I want to create another task here, and tasks are created during the runtime, and we don't know in the beginning how many tasks will be created after all, unlike for loops. But the runtime system somehow distributes all the available tasks to all the available underlying threads. So this is the idea behind this. So syntactically, it looks like this. So again, so it is generally assumed that you are in a parallel region. So you in the beginning you execute a parallel pragma, and inside the parallel inside the statement that is executed inside the parallel pragma, you do something like this. So you say hash pragma OMP task followed by arbitrary C statement S. So it creates a task executing this statement. And it actually indicates to the runtime system, okay, so this S can be done by another thread. And I can continue executing whatever comes after this statement S. So I will do something else while some other threads are doing S. So this is the idea of task. And here's another pragma called task wait. So if it is issued by a task, then it waits for all the child tasks it created to finish. So you generally execute the program, you created some tasks along the way, and after some point, you just wait for those tasks to finish. So this is how you use tasks. So the whole point here is that you can create another task at pretty much anywhere in your program. So unlike for loop, in which you basically need to say, okay, so here's, for example, 100 iterations I want to distribute among threads. You don't have to say exactly how many tasks you created. You create up front, right? So during the course of the execution, you can you can say, okay, so here I want to have another task that can be done concurrently. So this flexibility is the whole point of the task parallelism. So here's the typical template in which you want to use task parallelism. So like OMP4 loop, so you first need, you still first need to do this OMP parallel in the beginning. And almost all the time, right after you enter this parallel region, you use another pragma, which I haven't explained so far, but something called OMP master, which basically says, okay, so the following statement is done only by master. So just remember that the default behavior of this parallel thing is each of these threads does the same thing. But when you use tasks, basically you need to, but it is almost always the case that in the beginning you only have a single master thread or a single root task from which all the tasks will be created, right? So it is almost always the case that you want to have something called the OMP master to say, okay, so this statement will be executed by just one thread, not by all threads. And here I'm calling a function, let's say MS. And inside this MS, so the most typical situation in which task parallelism can be profitably used is something like this. So you have a recursive calls. You can do these multiple recursive calls in parallel. So you just say OMP task and OMP task for each of these recursive calls. And after you have done these two recursive calls, you just wait for these two recursive calls to finish. So like I said, this recursively creates many tasks, even though on the surface, it just creates two tasks. So here's what is likely to happen at runtime. So here's the root task. So you have two recursive calls, each done by separate tasks. So these two these two may be executed in parallel. And each of these tasks will recursively creates two more tasks. And this continues until the entire work gets small enough. So this is how task parallelism can be most profitably used. So again, so what is this concept of tasks good for? So the strength is its flexibility. So compared to the ordinary for loop, so you can create a task at any point during the computation. So along the way, and you can create many tasks. So unlike you create, for example, 1,000 threads, which is very problematic from the operating system's point of view and also performance point of view. It's totally okay to create, let's say, 1,000 tasks, even millions of tasks. So tasks are supposed to be much more lightweight than threads. So it's perfectly okay to, for example, have, let's say, 50 underlying threads, but let's say millions of tasks, which are distributed among these 50 threads. Okay, I got a question, an interesting question. So, is it possible to use parallel for inside a created task? I think there are so many limitations when you try to do something like this. So first of all, like I say, so parallel and for are two different things. So let's focus on first about parallel. So what happens if you have another parallel programmer inside some regions you are doing many tasks? I think in that case, this nested parallel doesn't have any effect because the tasks are supposed to be already inside the parallel region. So when you say parallel inside a task, then yeah, you are almost likely having a parallel nested inside another parallel class. So in generally speaking, there's some element of OpenMP specification that specifies what exactly happens in this circumstances. So parallel region nested inside another parallel region. But generally speaking, the nested parallel region is ignored. So syntactically, it is okay to have another parallel region inside a task, but normally it doesn't bring any benefit. So having OMP4 inside task, it's another interesting question. But well, I have never done that. I have never thought about doing it. Yeah, I think we need to see what actually happened, but most likely it's not going to work because, well, so it depends. It may depend on how you exactly say in the for pragma, but for pragma generally assume that all threads encounter the same for statement, the same for directive. And it tries to distribute all the iterations of this particular for statement to all threads. For example, when you say OMP4 schedule static, then you need to have all threads ready for executing this particular for statement. But generally speaking, when you are inside a region in which you are creating so many tasks, you end up doing very different things depending on the thread. So it is very likely that when a particular thread encounters a particular for statement, when other threads do not encounter the same for statement at all. So in that case, yeah, my bet is it's not going to work. Okay, you understand. Okay. Yeah, so it will be interesting to check. So yeah, like I said, the basic strength is its flexibility. And like I already suggested several times, it is especially good for nested parallelism and parallel recursion, something like this. And even if the original the workload is a serial for loop, you may still consider reformulating this parallel for loop into divide and conquer style as an alternative dynamic load balancing strategy. So task scheduling. So when you have so many tasks created at runtime, the runtime system is trying to distribute these tasks across all the threads at runtime. So it's somewhat similar to dynamic scheduling, but more general. So you may also consider task parallel formulation as an alternative load balancing strategy. So this is another visualization I just want to demonstrate of the same workload. So originally it is again the same doubly nested loop, but in that case we are trying to parallelize this using recursive divide and conquer. So in this way. So in on the picture, so you have two-dimensional iteration space, right? And you actually divide the entire iteration space into 4 subspaces. So by dividing both rows and columns, so in this way, so you end up creating 4 child tasks, and each of these 4 child tasks will create another 4 child tasks recursively. So this is exactly what I'm illustrating here. So here's another real-time demonstration. I guess this time I can do that on the web. So I have already executed this task parallel version. Task parallel version. Okay, so let me show you what it actually looks like. So the task. No, not this. And this one. Okay. So the task parallel version looks like this. So if the number of points, if the number of iterations you need to work on becomes smaller than some threshold, it simply does it sequentially. So this is what happens here. And otherwise, it creates 4 child tasks by this loop. So executed on exactly 4 times. And I have already executed this. And here's the visualization. So you can do exactly the same thing by yourself. Let me shrink it a little bit. So let me play this. So this is something that happens with this scheduling strategy. So let me pause it. Okay. So again, so remember that this lower triangular part does not have almost any work. So it's gonna finish very quickly. So the upper part will be divided further. So this part is almost entirely worked on by a single thread. So there's almost no communication or coordination happening in this region. But this part is representing much more work than this part. So many threads will get in to help work on this. And if you see this, so if you compare this to what you have seen with the dynamic scheduling I have just shown before, for example, something like this one. So you sort of instinctively feel that it's gonna be somewhat better than this very fine-grained division of the work, but in terms of the necessary communication coordination between threads. So this is indeed a point of task parallelism. Okay. Back to sparse matrix vector multiplication example. So even though the original formulation is just a single loop or doubly nested loop, depending on whether you're talking about coordinate list format or CSR format, you can consider dividing the work of sparse matrix vector multiplication in exactly the same way as I have just demonstrated with this 2D example. So just let's imagine that this is the matrix, right? And you can divide the entire matrix each time with this 2x2 decomposition. So you are not only dividing the work into rows. So you are dividing at times even a single. And so for the reason I haven't fully explained yet. So this formulation can avoid the issue I was talking about several times, which is that different threads may be trying to update the same element of Y at the same time. So you can somehow avoid this issue too with this formulation. But I didn't describe the full details of why this is the case. But you may think about it by yourself. Okay, so it just almost done. So another thing you might want to know is that so OpenMP actually has another directive or concept called a task loop. So as its name suggests, it is. I think it is considered. It can be considered as another way of dividing, well, load balancing for loop. So syntactically, it has almost the same restriction as ordinary for loop, but the underlying execution mechanism is somewhat similar to task parallelism, which I have just talked about. But well, from a very high-level perspective, it is actually another way of distributing iterations of a for loop into multiple threads. So let me just demonstrate what actually happens if you do it with a task loop. So Okay, so okay, so this is how you execute the same program with the task group, and it is finished, and you do visualization again. So it takes some time to process the log. So, after a while, it shows some playback to that has been shown. So just be patient. Okay, so let me play this. So this is what happened with task group. Well, actually, I don't know how they are actually executing this task group, but again, it's sort of dynamic, but it's not as bad as dynamic for loop. I have shown several times, like this. So you generally do not want to have a scheduling strategy like this. So maybe you can play this with yourself like that. Okay, I guess for today I'm almost done. So task group. So I have talked about several ways to distribute the work or iterations into underlying threads. So the static scheduling, dynamic scheduling, and you can do divide and conquer using tasks. And it has its own. Each has its own pros and cons. And yeah, that down the road, when you do exercise, you want to think about, yeah, what is the most appropriate way of parallelizing a particular workload using for loops or tasks. Okay, so I guess for today, I think we are done. So if there's any question, you can ask now. Okay, so I guess we are done for today, and let's see you tomorrow, the next week.